Bullies mocked the new royal guard. Sure, he was just a rookie. But when their taunts turned violent, they learned the hard way. He was a combat-trained elite. Here's how it unfolded. But before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Also, make sure to check out our second channel, Guard Patrol, linked in the pinned comments, because we upload daily at the same time on both channels. So, subscribe to both and never miss a powerful story. The ancient stones of the royal palace stood stoic against the morning light, their weathered faces telling stories of centuries past. Among the grandeur, Private Garrick Henshaw maintained his post, his polished boots planted firmly on the cobblestone path. It was his first official day on duty as a royal guard, a position he had trained relentlessly to obtain. His scarlet tunic was pressed to perfection, the bearskin cap adding to his impressive height, while his white gloves covered strong hands that remained perfectly still at his sides. Behind his stoic expression, Garrick's mind remained alert as he scanned the surroundings with practiced precision. He had been standing motionless for nearly 2 hours, yet showed no signs of discomfort. Tourists passed by, many stopping to admire the guardsman's discipline, but none breached the invisible boundary of respect that surrounded his post. 6 months earlier, Garrick had stood among 50 candidates at the Royal Guard Selection Centre. What set him apart became evident during the grueling weeks that followed. While others trembled after 20 minutes of stance training, Garrick's form remained impeccable. His previous 8 years in the Special Forces had conditioned his body to endure far worse. "Your file says you served in classified operations," Captain Winters had noted during his evaluation. "With respect, sir, I cannot," Garrick had replied. His record spoke for itself. 3 tours in conflict zones and commendations that remained partially redacted even to the selection committee. The psychological evaluations had proven equally challenging. Candidates were subjected to 18-hour shifts, standing motionless, while instructors hurled insults and employed every distraction technique imaginable. "Most people think this job is about standing still and looking pretty," Sergeant Blackwood had told them, "but your mind must be sharper than your bayonet." When the final roster was announced, only 8 names were called. Garrick stood among them, not a flicker of emotion crossing his face, despite achieving his lifelong ambition. Now, as he embraced his post, Garrick understood the profound responsibility. The scarlet tunic and bearskin cap weren't costume pieces. They were symbols of unwavering protection. His ceremonial rifle weighed nearly 10 pounds, yet he held it as if weightless, his awareness extending to every movement around him, a skill that had served him well in far more dangerous situations than palace duty. "Remember," Lieutenant Collins had said during that morning's briefing, "your stillness represents our stability. In a changing world, you stand unchanging." As the palace bells chimed the quarter hour, Garrick performed imperceptible adjustments that prevented his muscles from cramping. His purpose was clear: to stand as generations had before him, an unwavering sentinel of tradition, discipline, and duty. It was this sense of duty that kept his awareness sharp, even as the afternoon crowd began to thin and the palace grounds grew quieter. Through his peripheral vision, Garrick noticed a new group approaching from the eastern gate. 3 young men sauntered across the palace grounds, their postures loose and unconcerned with the reverence most visitors displayed. At the centre walked Tyler Grayson, his expensive designer jacket unzipped despite the cool air, a smirk permanently etched onto his face. Tyler was 22, the son of a property developer who had never known the word no. His father's money had insulated him from consequences his entire life, creating a young man who viewed the world as his personal playground and its occupants as either obstacles or entertainment. Flanking him were Dean and Lucas, childhood friends who had evolved into something between followers and accomplices. "This place is boring as hell," Tyler announced, loud enough for nearby tourists to glance disapprovingly in his direction. "Can't believe we wasted an afternoon here." "Your cousin said we should check out the changing of the guard," Dean replied, scrolling through his phone. "Supposed to happen in like an hour." "Great! More guys in stupid hats walking in circles," Tyler scoffed, kicking at the manicured gravel pathway. The trio continued their disruptive progress through the grounds, Tyler occasionally bumping into other visitors without apology. A security officer had already taken notice, tracking their movement from a distance. "Hey, check it out," Lucas nudged Tyler, pointing toward Garrick's post. "New guy, haven't seen him before." Tyler's attention shifted to the motionless guard, standing at attention. Unlike the older guards they'd seen on previous visits, this one appeared younger, his posture impossibly perfect. "How can you tell he's new?" Dean asked. "My brother came here last week for some school thing," Lucas explained. "Said he memorized all the guards' faces. This one wasn't here." A slow, dangerous smile spread across Tyler's face. "First day on the job, huh? Bet he's still trying to impress the bosses." "What are you thinking?" Dean asked, recognizing the expression that typically preceded trouble. Tyler watched Garrick for a moment, noting the absolute stillness, the disciplined gaze fixed forward. "I'm thinking it's time to have some fun. These guys think they're so special with their fancy uniforms and stuck-up attitudes." "Security's already watching us," Lucas warned, nodding subtly toward the officer who'd been tracking them. "So what?" Tyler shrugged, already moving toward Garrick's post. "We're just tourists appreciating the local attractions. Come on, let's see how good this new guy really is." The three approached with deliberate casualness, but their intentions were clear in the predatory gleam of Tyler's eyes. He'd found his entertainment for the afternoon, testing the limits of the newest Royal Guard. "Hey there, soldier boy," Tyler called out as he positioned himself directly in front of Garrick. "First day on the job? Your hat's a bit crooked." Garrick remained perfectly still, his eyes focused on the middle distance as protocol demanded. Not a muscle twitched in his face to acknowledge the provocation. "Maybe he's deaf," Dean suggested with a snicker, circling to Garrick's side. "Nah," Tyler replied, stepping closer. "He's just playing the good little toy soldier, aren't you, mate?" A small cluster of tourists paused nearby, discomfort evident on their faces. A mother hustled her children away from the developing scene, whispering something about rudeness. "You know what I think?" Tyler continued, raising his voice. "I think this whole thing is ridiculous. Grown men playing dress-up, standing around like mannequins. What a joke of a job." Garrick's discipline remained absolute. His eyes didn't flicker. His breathing didn't change, but behind the mask of ceremonial stoicism, his mind was cataloguing details. 3 males, early 20s, the leader increasingly agitated. Potential for escalation rising. "Look at him pretending we don't exist," Lucas joined in, emboldened by Tyler's lead. "What's the point of all this anyway? It's not like the royal family needs protection from guys who can't even move." Tyler stepped even closer, now deliberately violating the respectful distance maintained by other visitors. His face was less than 2 feet from Garrick's. "I bet I know what you're thinking," Tyler taunted, his voice dropping to a stage whisper. "You're thinking you're better than us, standing there all high and mighty in your funny costume." He examined Garrick's face, looking for any reaction. "But you're just some nobody they dressed up to attract tourists. Probably couldn't get a real job." A small crowd had begun to gather at a distance, murmurs of disapproval spreading. An elderly man approached a nearby palace staff member, gesturing toward the scene. "Your silence is really starting to piss me off," Tyler continued, his initial amusement hardening into annoyance. "What are they paying you for this? To stand around looking constipated all day?" Dean laughed too loudly. "Maybe he's actually a statue. Should we check?" He reached out as if to poke Garrick's arm, but stopped short, still cautious enough to avoid actual contact. "You think you're tough?" Tyler pressed, circling Garrick like a predator. All that training just to stand still? My grandfather was a real soldier, fought in actual wars. He'd laugh at this pantomime. Garrick's eyes remained forward, his posture flawless. The only indication that he was flesh and blood, rather than marble, was the barely perceptible rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. "I'm starting to think he's actually some kind of robot," Lucas suggested, taking photos with his phone. "No real person has this kind of patience." Tyler's frustration was mounting visibly, his face flushing with anger at being so completely ignored. What had started as casual amusement was evolving into a personal challenge, one that Tyler had no intention of losing. "Trust me, new guy," he said, his voice dropping to a threatening growl. "Everybody breaks eventually, and I've got all afternoon to find your breaking point." 15 minutes had passed, and Tyler's patience was wearing thin. His initial amusement had curdled into something darker, a personal affront that this uniformed man would dare to ignore him so completely. "You know what I think?" Tyler's voice had lost its mocking edge, now sharp with genuine anger. "I think you're scared. That's why you're hiding behind that stupid uniform and those rules. You're just a coward with a fancy hat." A palace security officer had begun moving in their direction, but Tyler paid no notice, focused entirely on breaking Garrick's composure. "Maybe he's got family watching," Dean suggested, glancing around nervously as he sensed the shifting mood. "Doesn't want to disappoint them." Tyler seized on this new angle. "Is that it? Your mummy and daddy in the crowd? Would they be ashamed if their little boy broke character?" He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Or maybe they're already ashamed, having a son who plays dress-up instead of doing something worthwhile." Behind his impassive exterior, Garrick was making continuous assessments. The leader was becoming unstable. The peripheral tourists were backing away, sensing danger. Security was approaching, but still 30 seconds out. The situation was degrading rapidly. "We should probably go," Lucas muttered, tugging at Tyler's sleeve. "Security's coming." "Not until I get a reaction," Tyler snapped, shaking him off. Tyler circled around, moving close to Garrick's ear. "I wonder what it would take. Should I insult your queen? Your country? Or maybe—" His lips curled into a cruel smile. "Maybe I should tell everybody what a fraud this whole thing is." He stepped back and addressed the gathered onlookers, voice raised theatrically. "Ladies and gentlemen, don't be fooled by this charade. These guards aren't elite soldiers. They're just failed actors in costume." Several tourists looked appalled. An American woman loudly told her husband this was exactly why people hate tourists. Tyler turned back to Garrick, frustration building to a breaking point. His eyes narrowed as he searched for some weakness, some button to push. "Last chance, toy soldier," he hissed. "Give me something. A blink, a twitch. Anything to prove you're not just a waste of oxygen standing here." Garrick remained statute still, but his training had shifted him to a state of heightened readiness. The threat assessment had moved from verbal to imminent physical. "Fine," Tyler said, taking a step back, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "If words won't work, maybe this will get your attention." "Tyler, don't—" Dean's warning came too late. Tyler Grayson had made his decision, propelled by wounded pride and the accumulated rage of being so completely ignored. He stepped forward with deliberate purpose, invading the sacred space directly in front of the guard post. "Young man, stop right there," an older gentleman called out from the crowd. "Security is coming. Don't be foolish." But Tyler was beyond heeding warnings. In his mind, this had become a contest of wills, and he refused to be the one who backed down. He planted himself squarely before Garrick, close enough that their faces were merely inches apart. "Last chance, soldier boy," Tyler growled. "Blink, speak, anything, or find out what happens when people ignore me." Garrick remained motionless, but internally his combat training had fully engaged. His awareness had narrowed to the immediate threat, calculating angles, distances, and response options while maintaining his ceremonial stance. Something in Tyler's expression shifted, the final internal barrier between thought and action crumbling away. "Have it your way," he snarled. Time seemed to slow as Tyler's right arm drew back, hand forming a tight fist. The crowd gasped collectively, several people shouting warnings. Security officers broke into a run, but they were still too far to intervene. Tyler's punch launched forward with the full force of his weight behind it, aimed directly at Garrick's jaw. The attack was telegraphed, unrefined. The strike of someone who had started many fights but received little formal training. In the milliseconds before impact, Garrick made his decision. The protocols were clear about protecting the dignity of the uniform, but they were equally clear about the right to self-defense. As the fist closed the final inches toward his face, calculations completed in his combat-trained mind. The world around them seemed frozen in this crucial moment. Onlookers with hands covering mouths, security officers in mid-sprint, Tyler's followers backing away from what they now realized was a terrible mistake. Tyler's expression held absolute certainty as his knuckles cut through the air toward their target. He had never faced consequences for his actions before, and he expected none now. The arrogance in his eyes reflected a lifetime of entitlement, a belief that the world would always bend to his will. That certainty was about to be shattered as his fist closed the final distance toward Garrick's impassive face. In the final fraction of a second, Garrick Henshaw moved. The transition from ceremonial stillness to combat readiness happened with such fluid precision that onlookers would later debate exactly what they'd witnessed. One moment, Garrick stood in perfect guard position. The next, Tyler's punch hit nothing but air as Garrick's head shifted minutely to the side. Simultaneously, Garrick's right hand released his ceremonial rifle, which remained perfectly upright, supported by his left, and captured Tyler's extended wrist in a lightning-fast grip. With a subtle pivot and twist that utilized Tyler's own momentum, Garrick redirected the punch's energy, sending the young man off balance. Before Tyler could process what was happening, Garrick had executed a textbook joint manipulation, applying precise pressure to Tyler's wrist and elbow. The movement was controlled, economic, and devastatingly effective. Tyler found himself suddenly facing away from Garrick, his arm immobilized behind his back, his shoulder locked in a position that sent clear signals of pain without causing actual damage. "What the?" Tyler gasped, his bravado evaporating into shock. "Remain still, sir," Garrick spoke for the first time, his voice calm and measured despite the situation. "Further resistance will result in discomfort." The crowd erupted in surprised murmurs and scattered applause. Security officers slowed their approach, recognizing that the situation was already under control. "Let go of me!" Tyler struggled briefly, only to freeze as Garrick applied the slightest additional pressure to the joint lock. "I cannot do that until I'm certain you no longer pose a threat," Garrick replied, his tone professional rather than antagonistic. "Your attempt to assault a royal guard is a serious offence." Dean and Lucas backed away, hands raised in surrender as security finally reached the scene. "We didn't do anything," Dean protested weakly. "It was all him." "You broke protocol," Tyler snarled, trying to salvage his dignity. "You're not supposed to move." "Protocol permits appropriate response to direct physical threats," Garrick explained calmly. "Royal Guards are soldiers first, ceremonial figures second." Tyler twisted his head to look back at his captor, disbelief evident on his face. "Who the hell are you?" Garrick maintained the hold with seemingly effortless control, his posture still parade ground perfect despite the altercation. "Former Special Forces, current Royal Guard Private Garrick Henshaw, and you, sir, have made a significant error in judgment today." As security officers approached to take control of the situation, Tyler made one last desperate attempt to free himself. With a sudden jerk, he tried to twist away from Garrick's grip. The move might have worked against an ordinary opponent, but Garrick had anticipated it. In a fluid motion that seemed to defy physics, Garrick adjusted his stance and redirected Tyler's energy downward. Tyler found himself kneeling on the cobblestones, still securely controlled, but without having been thrown or struck. "That was inadvisable," Garrick noted, his voice still remarkably composed. "Please remain still while security arrives." Dean, seeing his friend subdued, made a poor decision. "Let him go!" he shouted, lunging forward with misguided loyalty. Garrick, still maintaining control of Tyler with one hand, used his free arm to deflect Dean's wild charge. A subtle redirection of momentum, a perfectly timed pivot, and Dean stumbled past, off balance, and confused by how he'd missed his target entirely. "I wouldn't," Garrick advised Lucas, who had begun to edge forward. The calm certainty in Garrick's voice froze Lucas in place. The security team arrived, 2 officers taking control of Tyler, while a third moved to intercept Dean and Lucas. "He assaulted me," Tyler protested as he was helped to his feet. "We have numerous witnesses and security footage," the lead officer replied, gesturing to the cameras mounted discreetly around the palace grounds. As the security team began to lead the 3 troublemakers away, the senior officer turned to Garrick. "Will you be pressing charges, Private Henshaw?" Garrick had already resumed his ceremonial stance, rifle once again held perfectly in position. "I'll defer to palace protocol on the matter, sir." The gathered crowd had grown larger, people whispering in amazement. An American tourist called out, "That was incredible! Where did you learn to do that?" Garrick remained at attention, but the palace security officer nodded. "You may address the situation, Private. Circumstances warrant it." With a precise movement, Garrick stepped forward from his post. "My training includes 8 years with Special Operations Units," he explained, his voice carrying across the now silent crowd. "Royal Guards are selected from military personnel with extensive combat experience." He demonstrated a simple wrist control technique on the security officer, who had volunteered to assist. These methods are designed to neutralize threats with minimal force. I could have responded more aggressively, but that wasn't necessary. Tyler, still held by security but within earshot, watched with growing comprehension of how badly he had misjudged the situation. "Royal Guards undergo 2 years of specialized close protection training beyond standard military service," Garrick continued. "We're taught to remain ceremonial until circumstances demand otherwise. What you witnessed was the most moderate response available to me." The crowd murmured appreciatively as Garrick demonstrated another defensive technique, the movements precise and controlled. "In my previous assignments, I've had to maintain composure under far more challenging circumstances than verbal provocation," he added. "Standing motionless while being taunted is considerably easier than doing so under enemy fire." Meanwhile, the security team had moved Tyler and his friends to a bench nearby while awaiting transport. The crowd remained, captivated by this rare glimpse behind the ceremonial facade of the Royal Guards. "Before joining the Royal Guards," Garrick continued, his posture still military perfect despite having stepped away from his post, "I served 3 tours in active conflict zones. My unit specialized in high-risk extractions and protection details." A retired military officer in the crowd nodded in recognition. "Which regiment, son?" 42 Commando, Royal Marines, sir. Then selection for Special Operations," Garrick replied with a respectful nod. "I can't elaborate on many of my deployments, but I can say they taught me that true strength often lies in restraint." Tyler's belligerent expression had faded, replaced by grudging attentiveness as Garrick spoke. "During my second tour, our unit held position in a village under bombardment for 72 hours without relief," Garrick recounted, his voice matter-of-fact rather than boastful. "We couldn't move, couldn't sleep, couldn't break discipline even as shells landed within 50 meters of our position. Maintaining ceremonial stillness on palace grounds is peaceful by comparison." He gestured to his ceremonial uniform. "This isn't a costume, it's a continuance of service. Every royal guard has similar backgrounds. The man who trained me stood motionless during a terrorist incident, maintaining his post while directing civilians to safety through nearly imperceptible lip movements. He received the King's Gallantry Medal, but never broke stance. The crowd had grown completely silent, tourists and locals alike hanging on every word. The bearskin cap adds 11 inches to my height and weighs nearly 2 pounds, Garrick continued. On summer days, the temperature inside can reach over 100 degrees. Yet we stand because that's our duty, unchanged for centuries. He turned slightly, addressing Tyler directly now. The verbal provocations you offered today, I've endured far worse from enemy combatants while maintaining my cover. Your physical threat registered as minimal compared to situations where breaking composure meant death for civilians under my protection. Tyler's face had drained of colour, the full reality of whom he had attempted to assault finally sinking in. Garrick moved closer to where Tyler sat between the two security officers. Despite the young man's earlier aggression, Garrick's demeanour remained professional, neither condescending nor angry. "Mr. Grayson," he said, having overheard the security officers using Tyler's name, "I'd like you to understand something about what happened today." Tyler looked up, a complex mixture of emotions crossing his face: embarrassment, lingering defiance, and a dawning respect he seemed reluctant to acknowledge. "The Royal Guard isn't about the uniform or the ceremony," Garrick explained, his voice carrying to the gathered onlookers but clearly directed at Tyler. "Those are symbols of something deeper, a commitment to stand firm when it would be easier to yield." He glanced toward the palace, then back to Tyler. "The stillness you mocked represents values our society increasingly struggles to maintain: patience, discipline, respect for tradition, and placing duty above personal comfort." A few people in the crowd nodded in agreement. "When visitors from around the world come here, they're not just photographing men in distinctive uniforms," Garrick continued. "They're witnessing a living embodiment of principles that have sustained our nation through centuries of challenge." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The protocols I follow aren't meaningless rituals. They connect me to every guard who has stood this post since 1660. That lineage demands respect, not for my sake, but for what it represents." Tyler shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't think—" "That's precisely the problem," Garrick interrupted gently. "In a world of constant stimulation and immediate gratification, the capacity for thoughtful reflection becomes rare. You sought to disrupt my stillness because you couldn't understand its purpose." He looked at Dean and Lucas as well. "True strength isn't found in dominating others or demanding attention. It's found in serving something greater than yourself, whether that's your country, your community, or simply your own highest principles." Garrick straightened, his bearing reflecting the values he described. "I don't hold anger toward you. Your actions today stemmed from misunderstanding rather than genuine malice. But I would ask you to consider what you stand for. What principles guide your actions when no one is watching?" He gestured toward the palace grounds. "Every person who wears this uniform was first a soldier who risked their life in service. The privilege of standing guard here was earned through years of proving our commitment to protecting others, often at great personal cost." Tyler's expression had transformed, the arrogance replaced by something approaching shame. I'm sorry," he said, the words seeming unfamiliar on his tongue. Garrick nodded once, accepting the apology without further comment. "The choice of how to proceed from here is yours. This moment could remain simply an embarrassing incident, or it could become a turning point. The difference lies in what you take from it." Tyler Grayson stood slowly, his demeanour completely transformed from the cocky troublemaker who had arrived at the palace grounds an hour earlier. "I really am sorry," he said, genuine contrition in his voice. "I never stopped to think about any of it, really." He glanced at his friends, who nodded in agreement, their earlier bravado replaced by evident embarrassment. "We were being complete idiots," Dean admitted. "I don't even know why, except that's just what we always do." The senior security officer stepped forward. Given Private Henshaw's willingness to use this as a teaching moment and your apparent sincerity, we'll be issuing formal warnings rather than pressing charges. However, you'll all be escorted from the grounds immediately. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, many visitors approaching Garrick with newfound respect before moving on. An elderly veteran offered a crisp salute, which Garrick returned with precision. "Time to return to post, Private," the security officer said with a nod of approval. With parade ground precision, Garrick pivoted and marched back to his station. Within moments, he had resumed the ceremonial stance, ramrod straight, eyes forward, ceremonial rifle positioned perfectly at his side. To casual observers, it appeared nothing had changed, yet something had. The atmosphere around his post carried a new sense of appreciation. Tourists who had witnessed the incident now viewed the motionless guard with understanding rather than mere curiosity. Children who had previously giggled at the funny hat now whispered questions about the brave soldier. As the palace grounds returned to their tranquil state, Garrick reflected briefly on the incident. The uniform he wore had once again served its purpose, not just as a symbol of tradition, but as a living reminder that beneath the ceremony lay substance, behind the stillness lay strength. And that brings us to the end of today's story of respect, discipline, and the hidden strength behind tradition. If you enjoyed this glimpse into the world of elite royal guards, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories that reveal the extraordinary behind the ordinary. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss our weekly uploads. Check out our other videos appearing on your screen right now to discover more inspiring stories of honour and service. Now I'd like to hear from you. What would you have done in Garrick's position when faced with those provocations? Have you ever witnessed someone standing up to bullies in an unexpected way that taught everyone a valuable lesson? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and we'll see you again tomorrow at the same time with another brand new video. Until then, remember that true strength often lies in restraint, and the most powerful responses are rarely the loudest ones.